Welcome to episode 288 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent John Tamm. This time, he reviews his tenure on the Boston Division's Justice Task Force and the investigation and conviction of former FBI agent John Connolly for racketeering, obstruction of justice, and bribery related to his handling of informants Whitey Bulger and Flemmi. John Tamm served in the FBI for 30 years. He spent most of his career in the Philadelphia Division, working complex organized crime, labor racketeering, public corruption, civil rights, street gangs, and illegal drug investigations. During his FBI career, John, in addition to his assignment on the Justice Task Force, served for a short period in the Atlantic City Resident Agency out of the Newark Division. His last assignment before retiring was serving as an FBI liaison to the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks, 9/11 Commission, and as a member of the professional staff of the commission. After his retirement, he worked for the government contractor Booz Allen Hamilton as a military law enforcement and intelligence consultant. Currently, John is employed as a principal administrative officer for the Presbytery of Eastern Virginia. We spoke previously with John Tamm in episode 191 when he reviewed his investigation of labor official Frank Sheeran, a.k.a. the Irishman. John's case reviews are always so comprehensive. He has an unbelievable memory. Now, before we get to the interview, I want you to know that I had a chance to watch the new FBI TV show, Class of '09, which premiered last week and is streaming on Hulu. I was an FBI consultant for the series, and I really appreciate the shout-outs the show's creator and executive producer, Tom Rob Smith, has given to me, an FBI retired case file review. I plan to write a review of Class of '09 in my June email to reader team members. If you are a new listener, welcome to the podcast. Now, in your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team, which is all about crime fiction, and to learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent John Tamm. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm fine, Jerry. Thank you.
Well, I have been talking to you about reviewing the John Connolly case for a while now. You were on this show on FBI Retired Case File Review a couple of years ago when we had you review the Frank Sheeran case. And Frank, of course, was a Teamster Union official.
Yeah, that's right. He subsequently, just like some of the characters in this case, had movies based on their activities, not necessarily on fact, made about their criminal activities. In this case, the FBI agent, or then retired FBI agent we were investigating in Boston, was John J. Connolly Jr., and he had been associated with a notorious criminal in Boston by the name of James J., nicknamed Whitey Bulger. Although Bulger didn't like that nickname and preferred to be called Jimmy. But that's interesting because Sheeran, his story, so to speak, was the focus of the movie The Irishman. And there were several movies about Bulger. The one that I recall right off the top of my head was The Departed, but there was other ones also.
Did you ever watch the movie Departed?
I did watch the movie Departed. It was not particularly factual. The issue is that there isn't a whole lot known. There's a lot known about Bulger. I mean, he was tried in Boston, I want to say back in 2012, for a series of crimes, including murder, that he had committed over about a 30-year period. So he was very notorious, but it was a strange situation in Boston. His brother William was a state senator and the president of the state senate. and obviously had a significant amount of influence in the state, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in the government. And I wouldn't say Bulger was tolerated. That's not the best way to describe it, but he wasn't public enemy number one, even though he actually was in the Boston area. The thing that made the case unique was that he'd also been an erstwhile informant of Special Agent John J. Connolly Jr., along with Bulger's criminal partner, a guy named Stephen Flemmi. And they both belonged to a criminal gang there. It was known as the Winter Hill Gang. And it was named after the area where they first organized in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is just to the north of Boston. I got to Boston in January of 2000. I'd been recruited to replace an agent from Philadelphia who was rotating out. At the time, I was assigned to the Newark division. I'd just gone there a year earlier, and this seemed like a good opportunity for me to work on an interesting case. And so I did volunteer and was selected to go to the Boston Justice Task Force. That was the name of the unit. And it was made up of an inspector in charge, Gary Bald, about 4 other agents, and then 4 professional support people, including financial analyst who was excellent, and all of our support employees were great. We had intelligence analysts and database experts, and we were located in our own office. We were not in the Boston division offices, although we weren't very far from them, and still used their garage for the cars we had assigned to us. And it was in downtown Boston. I got there 1 year after it had started, and Connolly had already been indicted on the initial indictment. There subsequently was a superseding indictment.
I don't know if we've been clear about it, but John Connolly was the handler for Whitey Bulger, who was and has been officially confirmed an informant for the FBI. Is that correct?
That's right. Bulger and a second guy named Stephen Flemmi. Connolly's background was, I looked it up in anticipation of this interview. Connolly became an FBI agent in 1968. At the time, he was a school teacher in the Boston school system. He had a recommendation letter from the then Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, John McCormick, and written directly to then Director J. Edgar Hoover with the salutation, "Dear Edgar." And as I say, he started in 68, and his initial office of assignment, I believe, was Baltimore. He was there for the standard 1 year. He then went to San Francisco. He was there for a couple of years, and he came back to the New York division. And by 1974, I think it was, he had been reassigned to the Boston division, and it was his hometown. And so in 74, he was in Boston, and sometime after he arrived, he started to develop Whitey Bulger as an informant along with Steve Flemmi. Connolly had the advantage in this case of having known Bulger before he joined the FBI. Actually, he had known Bulger when he was a child. He had told people that he'd first met Bulger when he was 8 years old in South Boston, which is a neighborhood. It's on the harbor, not too far from the middle of Boston. So he had a neighborhood connection. And the interesting thing was they were kind of the 2 informants. When Connolly met with them, they always were together. He almost never met with them individually, if ever. So, go forward to Connolly worked Bulger, got decent, either from Flemmi or Bulger. Probably most of the decent information came from Flemmi, and it was information about the LCN family, the La Casa Nostra family that was in Boston, which was a branch of the larger Patriarcha family, which was located in Providence, Rhode Island.
This was a big deal. I mean, to get a high quality informant like that was a feather in an agent's cap. And so I take it that John Connolly was rewarded.
He received a number of accommodations, incentive awards. The Patriarcha family was headquartered in Providence. Rhode Island was within the Boston division. The 2 other states beside Massachusetts were Maine and New Hampshire. So it was geographically for the Northeast, a relatively large FBI division. Yes, and he was commended for his work with them because they were providing information about the branch of La Casa Nostra in Boston, which interestingly, I wouldn't call it ironically, but interestingly was headquartered in the north end of Boston on Prince Street, which was only about was less than a mile from where the FBI field division was located at the time in a federal building, named after, appropriately, John McCormick. So you didn't have to drive far to investigate them. They had a number of successful prosecutions, indictments, and then prosecutions. And with some of the information coming from Connolly's two informants, Bulger and Flemmi, especially to get electronic surveillance. But during that whole period of time, Bulger and Flemmi were still actively engaged in criminal activity, and they had a group of people around them, the most notable being a guy named John Mortorano, who continued to do murders, assassinations on their behalf.
Because some people in the audience are not as familiar as we are with the FBI and informants, could you talk a little bit about informants and criminal activity?
Well, criminal informants are criminals for the most part, and that certainly was the case with Bulger and Flemmi, and they were considered top echelon informants. It was a program that the FBI had started in the 60s, 1960s, to address organized crime. And they both, Flemmi and Bulger, were considered top echelon because they were at the top of their own criminal group, the Winter Hill Gang. Connolly did everything he could. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. Connolly, when he could, would be a better way to describe it, would intervene on their behalf when they were in criminal activity they might be engaged in. And he would also try to deflect investigation from Bulger and Flemmi when he could. And so that was ongoing. But what happens with this particular case where Connolly was successfully prosecuted was that Connolly retires from the FBI in 1990, and he takes a job at the local electrical utility, which is called Boston Edison, as their security officer, government affairs officer, for lack of a better term. And so he still has contacts in law enforcement, but the two informants are closed. There's no effort to introduce them to another agent, which often happens in the FBI. If an agent retires, occasionally their informants can be introduced and turned over to somebody else. I mean, that happened in my case when I transferred from Philadelphia to Newark, and a couple of my informants kept working with other agents. But these two informants were closed. So we're now in the 1990s. They're continuing to engage in criminal activity. And they were being investigated by the organized crime unit of the Massachusetts State Police, as well as the local office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. So Bulger especially was heavily involved in cocaine importation into Boston, especially South Boston. And Flemmi was continuing to engage in extortionate collection of credit, illegal gambling business, that sort of thing. It's kind of ironic from my perspective today that, considering how gambling is just everywhere, sports bookmaking, you can make a bet on your iPhone. But back then, criminal gangs basically controlled sports bookmaking, off racetrack betting, and illegal casinos, because none of those things existed up in that part of New England. Anyway, that's what these criminals were involved in. And interestingly enough, one of the few things that were legal, besides pari-mutuel betting on horses and dog races, was highlight.
Could you explain to people what World Highlight is? Because there may be people listening that have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, highlight is a game that's like a big handball game or racquetball game. It originates in the Basque region of Spain, and 2 or 4 players play against each other, and they use a special, for lack of it's called a cesta, a basket, and it's worn on either the right or left hand, and it catches the ball, and then they throw it back against a granite wall. And it's so, if you could imagine a racquetball or handball court that's about 5 times as large, they play the game on that court, and it's a 2-wall game. So it's the front wall and a side wall, depending which way the court is facing. And you can bet on who's going to win and it's a pari-mutuel system, just like horse racing. There's a 20% take for the state and the operators of the arena, which is called a fronton. And, you win money. prior to all this expanded gambling in the country, it was a pari-mutuel gambling operation that was legal in a number of states. It was most commonly found in Florida. But World Highlight also had an arena up in Connecticut that was very popular. That was Highlight. You could go on YouTube and see the game being played now. I'm not sure today if there are any Highlight operations. I don't know that, but I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it. And so they had become interested in the very successful Highlight Fronton in Connecticut, and it was run by an outfit called World Highlight. And they were trying to muscle in on that. World Highlight had several other Frontons down in Florida, Tampa, and in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area. So they being Flemmi and Bulger, were trying to force the way in on that. I guess one of the things I want to say is the first crime, at least chronologically, that was charged in Connolly's indictment was his participation in the murder of an FBI informant, an actual FBI informant by the name of Richard Castucci. Now, I want to say right up front that this was charged as a predicate offense in the racketeering indictment that Connolly was convicted of, but this particular racketeering offense or predicate was not proven. So, be that as it may, it is part of the record. Castucci was killed because he had provided information about an FBI top 10 fugitive who had been a member or was a member of the Winter Hill Gang by the name of Joseph Maurice McDonald. And McDonald was a murderer, had escaped from prison, was wanted for a number of crimes, other crimes. He had open warrants on him in a number of places. And Castucci had found out, Castucci was a bookmaker for the most part, had found out that McDonald was in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. So he told that to his agent handler, who was not Connolly. But Connolly found out about it because he was on the same squad with this agent. And he alerted Bulger and Flemmi to the fact that Castucci had provided this information. So they contacted McDonald, they being either Bulger or Flemmi, and he moved from where he was living. So when the FBI went to hit the place, he wasn't there. And he remained a fugitive for about another 6 or 7 years. And during that period of time, he participated in at least one other murder that I'm aware of, maybe two. So that was the first case chronologically, but it was one of the last ones detected by our investigation. To kind of explain the dynamics, the state police had a unit that was working out of the U.S. Attorney's Office along with the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the two state police detectives were very senior in the Massachusetts State Police. There was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Thomas Foley and a major by the name of Thomas Duffy. And I don't remember the DEA agent's name. And then there was another state police detective. His last name was Johnson. He was a lieutenant. They had been putting together the case for which Bulger had been charged along with Flemmi and another criminal by the name of Francis Salemi or Frank Salemi, whose nickname was Cadillac Frank. Salemi was I'm not so sure if he was a member of the La Casa Nostra family, but he eventually was a major player in organized crime in Boston, say in the mid-'80s. So they had put together a case, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the two assistants there, was one gentleman by the name of Fred Wyshak and another one by the name of Brian Kelly. And kind of in the tradition of the old strike force attorneys, they were drawing in evidence that was investigated or found or detected by several different agencies, whether it was DEA, the state police, or FBI, and they had brought this together for a racketeering indictment, a RICO indictment of Bulger and Flemmi. Before I got there, Flemmi had claimed in a court filing that he had been given permission to commit these crimes. And if I can back up a little bit, so this indictment was returned on like in the first week of January 1995. But they had gotten complaints and warrants for Bulger, Flemmi, and Salemi in December of 94 with the intention of arresting them around the holidays.
John Connolly retired in 1990?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So at the time, he was no longer working as an FBI agent when these indictments were coming down.
That's right. And so question is, how did he know about it? And I'll answer that question. So there were these pending charges, and he was called by the then assistant special agent in charge in the Boston, one of the assistant special agents in charge in the Boston division, Dennis O'Callahan, who was also, I had worked with in Philadelphia. I knew Dennis O'Callahan, and he'd been an organized crime. He'd been on Squad 1, the organized crime squad in Philadelphia. So he was now the assistant special agent in charge in Boston, and he calls Connolly and tells him, I don't know if it was his intention that they flee, but the reality was Connolly immediately goes to the hangout of these two criminals, which was a place called Circle Liquor Stores in South Boston. And he talks to one of Bulger's underlings, a guy named Kevin Weeks. Flemmi and Bulger weren't there, and he tells him what's up. So Connolly didn't really have the whole picture, I guess. The indictment was going to occur in a couple of days. This would be like between Christmas and New Year's, but the complaint and warrant, so the arrest warrant was available to arrest all three of these people. Well, the word gets out, and Bulger, maybe he understood the federal rules of criminal procedure better than Flemmi, he takes off with his then girlfriend named Teresa Stanley. And Flemmi also becomes a fugitive. But Flemmi stays around town, and he gets arrested by the state police a couple of days later. So there are three defendants, but the only defendant in hand is Flemmi. And this was, I wasn't there then, but this was in 1995. When the case starts out, Flemmi then makes a claim that he had been given permission by Connolly and the FBI to commit these various crimes that he's being charged with in the indictment. So there is a series of evidentiary hearings, a significant story in Boston, and it was kind of the predication for the investigation that the FBI conducted of Connolly after these allegations were made by Flemmi. There was an effort to get to the bottom of it, and Flemmi was telling the judge, who was a judge named Mark Wolf, a U.S. District Court judge named Mark Wolf, that that they had gotten tipped off, and he basically didn't get his act together in time to get out of town. So the FBI came in to investigate that, and they started the Justice Task Force right after the first of the year, 1999.
Could you talk a little bit about those allegations in Boston as it affected the FBI? I mean, here's this organized crime figure who's saying that the FBI sanctioned, his criminal activity. And what were some of the things that the indictment said that they did? It
Well,
didn't include murders at that time, right?
No, not at that time. The superseding indictments, they were charged with dealing in cocaine, extortion and extortionist collection of credit, and gambling. Those were the predicates in the racketeering offense on the first indictment. There were superseding indictments because what occurs is that ultimately Flemmi decides to cooperate. Now, he's not cooperating with the FBI. He's being interviewed and handled as a cooperator by the state police and the Drug Enforcement Administration. He had a pretty good memory of what happened, and there's so much going on, about this investigation that it's hard to divide it. It's hard to focus on any one thing, but we were investigating Connolly as a criminal case. It wasn't like Office of Professional Responsibility or anything, because he was no longer an employee. So he's being investigated criminally. And so the Justice Task Force that I was on was being supervised by the Criminal Investigative Division in Washington. But parallel is you had local investigations, federal investigations, but not done by the FBI, of Bulger, Flemmi, and Salemi for the crimes I just went over. And that was being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And that's basically what happened. The search for Whitey Bulger as a fugitive, interestingly enough, was just didn't happen initially for 6 months. They didn't make an effort to find him. And because with that lead time, he was able to, get pretty far away. He first went to Louisiana, and he was there for a while, and ultimately made his way to Santa Monica, California. But he anticipated the problem of being indicted and locked up for the rest of his life. So he had prepositioned cash money across the United States, or at least outside of Boston, that he was able to obtain.
And I did do a two-part episode, episode 282 and 283, just about the fugitive investigation to find Whitey Bulger and his girlfriend. So anybody interested in details about that can listen to those two-part episodes. Let me ask you, when Flemmi is making all of these allegations, now John Connolly is out there free and hearing all of this.
Well, that's right. And one of the issues for both the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Department of Justice, because they were going to bring in special attorneys from Connecticut, was that the statute of limitations on the obstruction of justice part of the case, so the current 5-year statute was going to expire at the end of December of 1999. Because remember, Connolly tells them to take off in December of 1994. So they went ahead and indicted him at the time for racketeering, but most of the predicates were just based on two things. The obstruction of justice, or the racketeering indictment was based on the obstruction of justice and bribery, that he had been bribed by Flemmi and Bulger. So he's indicted and arrested and released on bail, and he's no longer working for the electrical utility. And so, yes, he was concerned, but this is an example of how concerned he was. He was ultimately convicted of an obstruction of justice tactic that he used, where he wrote a bogus letter to Judge Mark Wolf, purportedly from the Boston Police Department, on their letterhead, which he'd obtained, claiming that the electronic surveillance that was being used against Flemmi was corrupted because it was obtained by perjury. There was perjury in the application and the affidavits. So that occurred, I think that occurred in 1997. So that was one of the things that the FBI was trying to get their hands around. And it was just an example of him. He was still interested in obstructing the case. And then finally, he had tried the same tactic years earlier when Richard Castucci was murdered. In that case, he wrote a letter, an anonymous letter, to the local CBS affiliate television station, to tell them that Castucci had been murdered for pass posting, or some sort of pass posting means is that you make a bet after the race has been run. Because in the old days, it was like the movie The Sting, the information lagged, maybe as much as 5 minutes. So you could get a bet in, and if you already knew the result, and you could get the bet in anyway. And that Castucci had therefore defrauded his criminal confederates, and they killed him for that reason. So he wrote a letter for that, and there was a local broadcaster, like a street, like a reporter who made a big deal about it. And it was designed to distract whatever investigation the FBI was going to conduct of Castucci's murder. The disappointing thing to me, as a longtime agent and somebody who had a lot of good informants, was that they didn't really work on figuring out. Boston Division was more concerned about, at least in my opinion, just trying to close the case and not have a hard look at what happened. They were willing to accept an explanation like that, the pass posting one. And it was disappointing that they didn't figure out who had killed this guy, because I think they could have gotten to the bottom of it, and just knowing what they did about his associates. And Castucci was still engaged in bookmaking. I mean, but that's the type of crime that you would normally tolerate. That's not a violent crime, and unless you're doing an extortionate collection of gambling debt, that puts you in contact with a lot of other criminals.
But the truth was that he was killed not because of gambling, but because Connolly had provided information that he was cooperating.
That's right. Connolly had told Flemmi and Bulger, and they used a guy by the name of John Mortorano, not the Philadelphia John Mortorano, but the Boston John Mortorano, to kill Castucci. Castucci was killed in a room in an apartment house in Boston, near the Boston Garden. His body was taken down and put in the trunk of his car. This was like the 29th of December, 1976. was during a snowstorm. He was driven out to the Revere dog track, and his car was dropped off in the parking lot. And he was there for a couple of days where he got nice and frozen. His brother went out and found the car and called the police when he realized that there was something amiss. And so, Castucci was dead. It was pretty easy to figure out when he was dropped off because there was more snow on the, around the car than under it, that sort of thing. But there wasn't any comprehensive investigation conducted of this. They just deferred to the Revere Police Department, and they didn't get to the bottom of it because they didn't know the surrounding involvements of Castucci. He operated a restaurant, I think was his front, which is a good one because you have people come into the bar and, bet and stuff like that. So restaurants are frequently the location of sports books. So that was Castucci. Now, I think one of the most interesting things was how Connolly found out about the pending indictments and how we proved it. And so I'll address that if you don't mind. When the indictments came down and were going to be returned at the beginning of January in 1995, Dennis O'Callahan called Connolly at his office at the Boston Edison, and they knew not to talk on the phone to each other. So Connolly went down to the basement of the building that his office was located in, which was the John Hancock building. It's probably the largest skyscraper in Boston. It's right on Copley Plaza. And he went down to a pay station in the basement by the garage, and he called O'Callahan back at the FBI office. And like a lot of agents, Connolly was thrifty and didn't want to pay a quarter for the call. So he charged the call to his AT&T card, which didn't show a lot of smarts in my opinion. Anyway, we were able to confirm his calls using the AT&T card, and also the calls by O'Callahan to Connolly using the FBI's headquarters office's call registering system, which became common in FBI offices, I would say in the mid-'80s, where they log in electronically outgoing calls on the government phones. If you wanted to avoid that, you'd had to go out and get on a pay station. So that's how they put it together. And it was clear that O'Callahan had done that. And when he was interviewed about it years later, he admitted it.
And why did he do it? Did he do it knowing that Connolly would then let Bulger and Flemmi know? Or was he doing it because Connolly was a friend and he thought he might be interested?
I think he did it because Connolly was a friend. They were angry, collectively, that our informants, ours being the FBI's informants, were being prosecuted. As I said, it wasn't for the significantly more heinous crimes of murder at that time. And I think O'Callahan, he's passed on. He's been deceased for several years. I don't want to, all I know is what he said in court. So let's put it that way. I think he thought we owed it to the informants, maybe, even though they were no longer informants. And I'm not sure that he anticipated, he didn't say this, but he didn't anticipate that they would become fugitives. Matter of fact, Flemmi didn't leave. Flemmi didn't, he thought he had, an indictment in a couple of weeks. He would have a couple of more dates with his girlfriend and everything. This is Flemmi, and then leave. But they, as I say, they had a complaint and warrant for all three of them. And Bulger left immediately, as did Salemi.
So I guess this was like a courtesy call?
Yes, I don't, it was a courtesy call from O'Callahan. I don't know what O'Callahan said in the conversation. The only way we proved the calls were by the fact he used the AT&T card, and the calls were logged from the Boston office. Courtesy call. It showed bad judgment, but I'm not going to criticize Dennis O'Callahan here after the fact. The assistant or the special attorney, John Durham, decided not to call O'Callahan as a witness in the Connolly case. And I remember I and my partner had gone out to interview O'Callahan maybe a week before the case was to start. We just want to kind of see where everybody stood. It's not uncommon to do that with all your witnesses. see if anything's changed or if they've gotten cold feet or whatever. No, Callahan who was then living alone north of the city, he was cooperative, and I thought that he didn't want to testify, certainly, but, he would come down and tell the truth. So told Durham about it. My partner and I briefed Durham about our most recent interview. We wrote it up, and so he decided not to call O'Callahan. So I think the defense saw an opening there, which I think was a big mistake, because they then put O'Callahan on during the defense case. And that allowed Durham to cross-examine him. And Durham had the records of the telephone calls. And, he did a great job cross-examining him. And that basically forced him to admit that he had provided all this information to John Connolly. And the end result of it was that it obstructed the case by allowing two of the three defendants to become fugitives. And during the trial, Bulger was still a fugitive. Flemmi had been arrested, but Bulger was still a fugitive.
Can we go back a little bit? Because you said something significant, that there may have been some resentment with O'Callahan and Connolly because of this investigation of their informants by the DEA and the state police. Could you talk a little bit about that? Was that in frustration that these guys were doing all this activity and nothing was being done to them?
Yes, I think that in my opinion, the state police and the Drug Enforcement Administration in Boston had a legitimate complaint about the lack of cooperation from the FBI on Bulger and Flemmi. And it was kind of a surprising attitude to me. I mean, it was, understandably, informants can go bad on you, and frequently, they use the term go south on you, which, goes back to the Civil War. But informants can go bad because at the bottom line, they're criminal informants. They're criminals, criminal first, informant second. And I think that they resented the fact that the FBI had covered up for these guys. There were other instances. The owner of World Highlight, I mentioned Highlight earlier, was a guy named Roger Wheeler, and he lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in May of 1981, John Mortorano, who I mentioned earlier, and Joe McDonald, who I also mentioned, Joseph McDonald, both at the time fugitives, went to his country club, which was Southern Hills. They've most recently had a PGA tournament. Professional Golf Association's annual principal tournament was held there a couple of years ago, and there have been U.S. Opens there. They knew Wheeler's schedule, I think, on the day of the week. I believe it was Wednesday. And so when he came out to his car in the parking lot, they killed him. They shot him with a revolver.
I have done an interview on that case. Flemmi testified that retired agent Paul Rico provided information that assisted Martorano in Wheeler's murder. Rico was arrested in 2003 based on evidence from Flemmi when he was cooperating. And so anybody wanting to hear more about that murder can listen to episode 88.
I don't believe the charges against Rico that he was involved in the Wheeler murder, but that's just John Tamm's opinion. Wheeler was shot dead in the parking lot because the Bulger gang, Winter Hill, etc., wanted to take over World Highlight. And another thing they wanted to do is continue the skim they were getting from the parking at World Highlight's parking lots adjacent to the Frontons, because the state carefully regulated and watched the actual parimutuel money, but the parking proceeds, mostly cash, were available to be skimmed, and Wheeler had found out about it. So they killed him. And immediately, I don't know why this was the case, and I don't want to speculate about anything, but the Tulsa Police Department realized there was a Boston connection. Maybe interviewing Wheeler's family, or they might have told him that he was having trouble with them, or the Connecticut Fronton, that they were taking money there. So they contacted the FBI Boston through the Oklahoma City office. They contact Boston, and they don't get anywhere. When it's, do you know any of these people? Like Bulger and Flemmi, no, they didn't know them, even though they were actively open to informants. So probably the thing Boston should have done, if they had good management and good supervision, would have been to investigate this. But they did not. They didn't even confirm to the Tulsa Police Department that these were people who were associated with World Highline in one way or another, and that they actually had a kind of a stooge, a guy named John Callahan, also in the operation. I shouldn't describe Callahan as a stooge. A better way would be that somebody they had sufficiently intimidated that he would do what they wanted him to do. So they thought. Tulsa then probably reached out to the state police in Massachusetts to see if they could get any assistance, or maybe the Boston Police Department. But for the most part, back in the early 80s, you wouldn't get anywhere. So I'm sure it was very frustrating to them. Fast forward to when I got to the Justice Task Force, which was in January 2000. That Justice Task Force, which was made up of FBI agents and a couple of IRS agents and FBI support employees, had not worked with any other outside agencies. It was just the federal agents, the IRS agents, and the FBI agents, and the FBI support employees. So Gary Ball, I think to his credit, and John Durham, certainly to their collective credits, and the other assistant, Leonard Boyle, got things going where we were now going to work with the state police investigators. And I remember the first day they came to the office, they were very standoffish, I guess, understandably, thinking that if you were an FBI agent, you believed in Whitey Bulger. But we eventually were able to work with them, and they were the two lead detectives. They were high-ranking state police officers, one a lieutenant colonel and one a major. And Tom Foley, who was the lieutenant colonel, eventually became the commissioner of the state police. They were able to assist us significantly in the Connolly case. And the most significant breakthrough is that the U.S. Attorney's Office was able to get Flemmi to cooperate. So the two assistants over there working with Foley and Duffy, those two assistants were Fred Wyshak and Brian Kelly, worked out a deal where Flemmi would cooperate. So Flemmi started telling us about crimes that were not charged in the initial Connolly indictment. So we started to work on those cases and added a number of murders to it. There was the murder of Castucci, and then there was a murder of a guy named Halloran. And there was one other murder in there that Connolly was going to be charged with, and also an extortion that Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi engaged in by taking over the Circle Liquors in South Boston. They pushed the owner out, a guy named Stephen Rakes, and they, literally took over the business. And he went to the police department in Boston, had a relative there who was a detective, talked to the detective. Detective went to John Connolly, and Connolly told them the only way they would make the case is if Rakes wore a wire on Bulger. And Connolly also didn't suggest that he would be protected or go into the witness security program. So obviously Rakes didn't take that option. And then so that part of the case was belatedly charged in the superseding indictment. However, that also was not proven. That was one of the predicate acts that was not proven. The other thing that I don't want to forget is that Connolly's supervisor, a guy named John Morris, for a significant period of time in the 80s, was also corrupt and had accepted bribes from Bulger and Flemmi. And so he didn't provide any supervision of the operation of the informants or the reporting for the informants. And when Morris was questioned, say, by management, whether it was an ASAC or an assistant special agent in charge or the SACs, Morris told them that there was no problem. It was conjecture. There was, the state police were jealous, or the U.S. Attorney's Office or the strike force, wanted to screw up the informant program, and that they were providing information that allowed them to get the La Casa Nostra. And really, the La Casa Nostra branch of the Patriarca family was pretty much all locked up in Boston. So, you had that effective result, and it was hard to overlook that.
Like John Connolly, was John Morris indicted and tried on these accusations?
No, ma'am. When the issue came up about Flemmi being given permission to commit these crimes, the U.S. Attorney's Office made the decision, because Morris refused to cooperate. He was retirement eligible and promptly retired at the time he was working at FBI headquarters. They made the decision to give him total use immunity for anything involving this case, so he was never prosecuted. They, at the time, probably didn't realize the extent of his involvement with Connolly, because it was somewhat, obviously obscured. But Morris had even himself had contact with the informants. He had him over to his house for dinner one night or something ridiculous like that. That's Flemmi and Bulger. They gave him total immunity and he was not prosecuted. But he was used as a witness in our case against Connolly. He testified against Connolly, and also used in the case against Bulger when he finally was arrested and tried. So you had him available. He was available for testimony about the bribes and the obstruction of justice.
So now we have Flemmi, who is providing evidence to your task force about John Connolly's activities and what he did when he was an agent.
Right. We're getting more information from Flemmi about the violent crimes. I mean, the one that I worked on the most was Richard Costucci case. And there were other murders, including a guy named John Callahan down in Miami, or at the Miami airport. And in that case, Connolly was subsequently convicted by the state of Florida of that crime. To me, it was kind of an interesting situation that he was in custody. He was at Butner, which is a prison in North Carolina, and he was charged by the state of Florida with the murder of John Callahan on July 31st, 1982. Now, Callahan had replaced Roger Wheeler essentially as the manager of World Highlight, but not the owner. The family of Roger Wheeler still owned the business. Connolly, for one reason or another, not because he'd necessarily had any firsthand contact with Callahan, told Bulger and Flemmi that he thought Callahan was going to cooperate with the government, federal government, and also probably with Tulsa, Oklahoma Police Department, and they'd all be in jail. So they dispatched their preferred assassin, John Mortorano, from Boston down to Miami. And Callahan knew this guy, and he agreed to meet with him at the airport. They get into a car together, and Callahan picks him up, if I remember correctly, in Callahan's car, and Mortorano promptly shoots him, gains control of the car, puts Callahan in the trunk, leaves him parked out in the parking lot, and different than, say, a snowstorm in Revere, Massachusetts. In July in Miami, pretty quickly you have somebody dead in the car. So he was discovered by the local police, the Metro-Dade police, and investigations started. Kind of got nowhere other than he was employed by World Highlight. So almost a year after, or a little more than a year after the murder of Wheeler, Callahan's murdered. But again, the Boston division, didn't really turn and burn on this case. They didn't do anything. And Callahan was somebody they were trying to develop. Not Connolly, but other agents. So it was another dead informant or potential informant. But interestingly enough, we were talking about Flemmi providing information against Paul Rico. He also was the main witness in the case of John Connolly in Florida, where Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder, of the murder of Callahan, for participating in the murder with Flemmi and Mortorano. And the only direct testimony against Connolly was from Flemmi. But when you have co-conspirators, you don't have the same hearsay rule. So Mortorano was able to testify that he was told by Flemmi that Connolly had given them the information that required Callahan to be killed. But again, it was a pretty thin case, but they convicted him. And Connolly, after he finished serving his federal sentence, was transferred to Florida and started serving, what I consider relatively hard time there. He ultimately was released during the COVID pandemic because it was thought that because of his advanced age and everything that he might die of COVID in prison. As far as I know, Connolly's back in Massachusetts.
Let's go back to the initial investigation, because you said something interesting I wanted to talk to you about, and that was the attorneys for the government's prosecution came from the Connecticut U.S. Attorney's Office instead of the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office. Could you talk about that?
Well, that was a decision. I didn't have a role in that, and it was basically fait accompli when I got there. My understanding is it was decided to do that so there would not be a situation where you would taint the ongoing prosecution of Bulger, Flemmi, and Salimi by having now a second investigation of these same people. So they have different assistants, in this case, John Durham and Leonard Boyle, and we used a different grand jury, one out in Worcester, Massachusetts. So we weren't even in the Boston courthouse for the grand jury, and that's where the indictment was returned. Now, Massachusetts is all one district. They have courthouses in Boston, Worcester, and Springfield, Massachusetts, and we used Worcester Courthouse, which is kind of right in the middle of the state. And that's why they did it. They didn't want to have any challenges to the way the investigation was being conducted. And then there was another issue. There was an allegation, and I think this was one of the main reasons, against the U.S. attorney, a fellow named Jeremiah O'Sullivan. Flemmi was claiming that he had actually met with O'Sullivan, and O'Sullivan had given him permission to commit crimes. And so obviously, some of these assistants had worked for Mr. O'Sullivan. I don't believe that was true, of course. I think that was Flemmi wasn't telling the truth. But nevertheless, that was another reason for not having assistant U.S. attorneys from Boston. And as somebody who had a lot of trials or had a lot of successful prosecutions and always wanted to have a good relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office, whether it was in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania or the District of New Jersey, where I worked, the Boston division, when I got there in 2000, really had a bad relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So it was a difficult situation, I think, for the working agents. The agents wanted to accomplish something. But as I pointed out, the principal indictment over which Whitey Bulger was ultimately convicted was investigated by the Drug Enforcement Administration agents and the state police detectives. There was almost no involvement by the FBI in those cases. So other than the Justice Task Force, I mean, they were able to, bring up some of the bribery charges and stuff like that we had uncovered. But the murders and the drug dealing, that was all state police and DEA, and using assistant U.S. attorneys. I think that Fred Wyshak also served as under a special appointment to the state's attorney's office in Dade County on the Callahan case because he knew it very well, and he assisted in the prosecution of Connolly down there. He wanted to make sure Connolly did some hard time, I guess, but which was appropriate. I think that was effective for him to assist the state's attorney in Dade County.
You mentioned the name John Durham as the other prosecutor, and we are familiar with his name.
We know John Durham today because his next big case was he investigated Central Intelligence Agency agents for destroying tapes of aggressive interrogations in Afghanistan, like waterboarding and that sort of thing. And they were subpoenaed by Congress, and all of a sudden they disappeared. So they weren't available, and Durham was in charge of that investigation, trying to figure out what happened. And then he was assigned by Attorney General Barr to investigate the Russia collusion case, especially the Steele dossier, and he has been investigating that. As far as I know, the investigation has been completed, but that was his third big investigation. He was the first assistant. I think the titles have changed over the years, but he was the person immediately below the U.S. attorney in Connecticut. At the time, he was the special attorney for the Justice Task Force. And John Durham was a career prosecutor. He had been on the strike force in New Haven, Department of Justice strike force. And when those strike forces were closed down by Attorney General Thornburg, he became an assistant U.S. attorney. He was a very talented trial attorney, very talented in investigations. And so he was an obvious choice. And he had with him another excellent assistant by the name of Leonard Boyle. And we had occasionally would have another attorney would come from the Department of Justice Organized Crime Section to assist. I'm not going to mention their names because I can't really remember them very well. There was one other assistant by the name of William Nardini who handled the appeals after Connolly was convicted and was appealing his conviction. But that was the team, and we all sat in the same office. They were available to talk to anytime. It wasn't like you had to, like say in Philadelphia, you had to go over and sit in the waiting room with everybody else before you could get back and see the assistant. They were right there. Supportive process. We could obtain subpoenas, that sort of thing. You could obtain them immediately. And so I thought it was a very good model going forward. I don't know if it's ever happened since then, but it worked out well. The inspector in charge, Gary Bald, got along with them. Bald had experience with high-profile cases. He had been the case agent on Lee Beloff, who was a Philadelphia city councilman, who was extorting the Rouse Company way back in the 80s, around 87, 80, 88 maybe, or 86, 87. And so he had experience there. He'd handled informants. So he was a good person to have in charge of the case. And then we had a number of agents who all had good experience in criminal investigations. So that was an advantage. And then we also had our support employees, and especially the financial analysts who had experience in high profile cases and had been very effective investigators in their own right. That was the team. And one thing I wanted to mention, there was another key defendant in all of this who was identified by Flemmi, and that was a state police detective by the name of Richard Schneiderhan. He was a lieutenant on the state police, and he was the coordinator of organized crime intelligence. And Schneiderhan also was assisting Bulger and Flemmi to keep from being prosecuted, alerting them to investigations. And one of the most interesting and damaging things that Schneiderhan did was he had a relative that worked in the telephone company, a woman by the name of Linda Reardon, who was his niece by marriage. And so, in other words, she was the niece of his wife. Edward Duff is Reardon's father and also a bookmaker. So when the FBI would go in and need to get a lease line or the identification of pairs in a telephone box, this is, of course, we're dating ourselves, but that was the way electronic surveillance were done back in the 80s and 90s. Reardon would see the order, and she recognized the chief sound agent's name, or technical agent, excuse me, I'm dating myself. And when she saw that, she would identify the telephone numbers and normally then pass the numbers to her father, who would give them to Schneiderhan. And Schneiderhan would then, if it were somebody that he thought Bulger and Flemmi were, well, he would always give them the numbers. And if it was somebody that Bulger or Flemmi were interested in, they would alert the people that they were going to have their phones tapped, or they were in the process of having their phones tapped. And the most glaring example of this is that the FBI came and wanted to put PIN registers on the home telephone numbers of William Bulger, who was the state senator, and John Bulger, Whitey Bulger's other brother, who was a clerk in the court system, to see if they were calling any number anywhere that might give us a lead to where Whitey Bulger was. This was when he was a fugitive, so they got that information via Flemmi. The good news is then when Flemmi cooperated, he gave up Schneiderhan. And Schneiderhan was initially interviewed by the state police. And they did a good job getting him to admit what he did. And then he was also interviewed by the FBI after the fact and ultimately charged with obstruction of justice, which I think is Title 18, Section 1503. And also he might have been charged with false statement, which is 1001. He was probably also charged with conspiracy and Section 371, which is aiding and abetting. He actually also was tried. He was the last person tried in this series of cases. Connolly was convicted in March of 02, and Schneiderhan was convicted in March of 03. So he was the final defendant. His brother-in-law, Ed Duff, and his niece, Linda Reardon, were both pled guilty to obstruction of justice. And actually, Edward Duff was the last person I ever arrested as an FBI agent. I went down to Florida to arrest him. And during the winter, he lived in Stuart, Florida. And the local agent and I caught him out on the golf course. Thought he would have a full 18-hole round, but we only let him play 9. He had been doing this for a long time. I mean, they would sell this information. It was, rather a corrupt thing. I mean, the thing that I found interesting, kind of surprising, was the chances of a Boston technical surveillance being compromised was about 50%, because the orders would also come in when Linda Reardon wasn't working. But there was another guy there. His last name was O'Brien. We also convicted him. I don't remember his first name, but he worked the night shift, like 4 to midnight. So it was a very good chance that their technical surveillances were being compromised, but not all the time. But certainly it was a higher percentage probably than anywhere else, which would indicate to me that you have a problem at the telephone company.
Yeah.
But there wasn't any investigation into it. Reardon and Duff and O'Brien were all just, marching along with, selling the information essentially, or giving it to people like Stephen Flemmi. or Richard Snyderhan, who then gave it to Flemmi. And there was, really no inquiry into why that was happening. I remember that when I was in Philadelphia, the technical agent and the technical squad supervisor, they were very confident in the fact that our telephone people, our contacts there, were not going to compromise our information. They should have taken a harder look at why these technical surveillances were being compromised, but they did not. Schneiderhan was convicted and got a couple of years in jail. He's pretty old by then.
Why don't we flush out exactly what John Connolly was indicted for, how long the trial lasted, and the results?
Well, Connolly was indicted for racketeering, RICO. Counts 1 and 2 of his indictment were RICO and conspiracy to commit RICO. He had 14 racketeering acts, which included bribery, extortion, and obstruction of justice. And then he was individually charged with obstruction of justice for obstructing the investigation and prosecution of Bulger, Flemmi, and Salemi. Count 4 was he was charged with informing Salemi about the pending indictment, so Salemi became a fugitive. He was also separately charged in count 6 with writing a letter to the judge, Mark Wolf, that purportedly came from 3 unnamed Boston police officers to suggest that illegal electronic surveillance had been conducted on Flemmi. And he persuaded Flemmi to give false testimony in the case of United States versus Salemi. Connolly got Flemmi to say that under oath, testifying that he had not alerted Flemmi and Bulger to the pending indictment. When he was interviewed about this by a Boston agent back in like 1996, he lied to that agent, so a false statement. So those were the charges. And then the predicates, since it was a kind of a strange situation, at least in my opinion, they had 14 predicates, but he was only convicted of 4. So the predicate offenses that basically were violent crimes, like the murder of Castucci, the murder of Callahan, the extortion of Rakes, none of those were proven. But the predicates that specifically dealt with obstruction of justice were proven. And I think the problem with some of them, and I'm only saying what the appeals court said later on, was that in the case like of Castucci, it's not obstruction of justice under the law at the time to kill an informant. It's, of course, against the law to kill an informant, but this can't be construed as obstruction of justice unless there was a grand jury investigating what the informant was telling you. And I think it's that lack of connection was a problem. But nevertheless, he still got convicted, and he sentenced to 121 months by the trial judge, Judge Toro. And as I say, went off to Butner. And while he was there, he was indicted or charged. I don't know if they use grand juries in Florida, by the state's attorney in Dade County with the Callahan murder. So that was what he was convicted of. He was convicted of the 2 racketeering counts and the counts dealing with obstruction of justice and bribery, where he was bribed.
When you were investigating this case in Boston, did you feel any resistance or frustration in trying to interview people and conduct your investigation based on the tainted reputation of the FBI in the city?
Well, the worst reputation we had was with the state police, to a lesser extent, the Drug Enforcement Administration. But as far as just your generic, regular citizen witness, I don't recall, at least I didn't experience anything that was any negative, I don't know how I describe it, vibes, feedback, resistance, more so than what you normally get when you tell them you're with the FBI and you might be interviewing them about a friend or associate. But it wasn't because we had a bad reputation. One of the interesting things was Conley, his brother, was a DEA agent in Boston. So they had their own suspicions. I don't think they were founded or valid. So that was another issue. But mostly the state police felt that the FBI had never been straight with them about Bulger and Flemmi, which was true, and that Connolly had protected Bulger and Flemmi, and that was the issue. What you had was a major organized crime investigation that was going to be prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office with almost no FBI participation because of this animosity, which kind of leaked over into the U.S. Attorney's Office also. Because if I were an assistant and I'm just, giving you my perspective, you would have to wonder why the FBI Boston division didn't do something about Connolly. But it wasn't as apparent as everybody assumed. As I mentioned earlier, he was protected by his supervisor who, reassured everybody everything was okay. And they were getting good results from him vis-a-vis criminal intelligence. But the state police, I don't say we won them over. After the case was all over, Thomas Foley, the person who became the commissioner of the state police with the rank of colonel, wrote a book called Most Wanted. And he was very dismissive of our effort. He was dismissive of the FBI and dismissive of Gary Bald. And he didn't mention me, and I dealt with him probably more than anybody, but I guess that's the way it goes. So that was kind of strange. I think if you are a professional criminal investigator, you understand that occasionally people are corrupt, and the best thing to do is to identify them and prosecute them, not try to even scores or keep going back over how somebody was insulted or overlooked in the past. I mean, Connolly had a lot of influence over the organized crime investigative operation when he was at his peak because he had the two best informants. And you know how we handle the informants. You can't go in and say, well, I want to interview him. I want to talk to your informant. You have to rely on the case agent, the handler, to talk to the informant and then report back to you. It's not like you can, and matter of fact, you probably wouldn't in any case go out and interview somebody else's witness unless they gave you permission. So Connolly wasn't going to let anybody near Flemmi and Bulger, even though the new informant rules, even at that time, required the supervisor to have some contact with them. That was Morris, and Morris was as corrupt as Connolly. Well, not as corrupt, but corrupt like Connolly. Connolly was the most corrupt, needless to say. I mean, before Robert Hansen, Connolly would have been the most corrupt FBI agent I'd ever heard of.
Well, I think in the episodes that I did on the fugitive investigation of Whitey Bulger, and that again was 282 and 283, the FBI was able to redeem themselves with the state police who also worked with him on that fugitive case.
Yes, by the time Bulger was arrested, Foley had retired, so he wasn't actively involved anymore, as had Major Thomas Duffy. They were both retired, so they weren't actively involved in it. The only remaining state police and detective was Lieutenant Johnson. I wish I could remember his first name. He was very cooperative. He was very professional, and I liked him. And I know that when the Bulger case went to trial, Lieutenant Johnson, sat at the counsel table with the assistant U.S. attorneys and acted as the case agent, like we act on our own cases when they're on trial in federal court. That was an interesting thing about the Connolly trial. Connolly did not sit at defense counsel table. He sat with his wife and generally his three sons in the first row of the behind the bar of the courtroom. He never conferred with his lawyer when the jury was in the courtroom. So I think it was kind of, I can just speculate. Why did he do that? Why did he bring his family? But you used to see that in Philadelphia also. They'd bring their children or something like that and have them sit in the courtroom hoping to get sympathy. Most jurors see through that.
Well, this has been a fascinating case review. Usually, after the case review, I ask my guests to tell us why and when they joined the FBI. But we've already done that before when we did episode 191. But I still want to ask you for your words of wisdom and give you the last word.
The thing about this case that I found most disquieting was that the Boston division at the time didn't aggressively try to resolve why their informants were killed, and they didn't try to resolve why their technical surveillances failed. My words of wisdom is that, when that happens, management's got to really put a full court press on to see what went wrong, because those are two investigative techniques that we absolutely rely on.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find a photo of John Tamm, along with links to articles about the investigation of John Connolly. There's also a link to related FBI retired case file review episodes about the fugitive hunt for Whitey Bulger and the arrest of 78-year-old retired agent Paul Rico for his alleged involvement in the Wheeler murder. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.